have we have a couple more lasting into January when we'll be hosting Michael Twarwick. Today, however, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Marinda Lewis, based in Oxford, who is the editor of the Early Modern Letters Online EMLO project, an ongoing important project which has told us a lot about intellectual networks in early modern Europe. Marinda has worked as an editor and a copywriter for numerous publishers, libraries, and museums, as well as on a range of online scholarly resources. She's a graduate and postgraduate of the Courtauld Institute, which is one of the leading centers for the study of the history of art and visual culture, where she started her life with a focus on early modern portraiture, but has since moved onwards and upwards to many other interesting and exciting topics, including more textual things. So it is our pleasure to welcome Marinda Lewis, who is going to be speaking to us today about early modern letters online, recollecting correspondence and reconnecting correspondence networks. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is try to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint for you. Now, fingers crossed, this is going to work. There. Now, is everybody able to see my screen happily? Is that showing for you?
Yes, yes.
Good. All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for such a generous introduction and for inviting me to discuss with you some of the work that we're doing here in Oxford. It's an honor and it's a privilege, and I extend my thanks to all of you, and in particular to Stuart for arranging this session. I'm going to begin this talk by displaying a slide of the homepage of the database on which I work. It's a union catalogue of metadata of correspondence. So it contains listings of letters with information on the documents, the people that sent them, and the places they were living in, that they were writing and sending their letters from and to. And these people writing the letters were alive sometime between 300, 400 or 500 years ago. And this is a database that I'm showing you that underpins much of what we're going to discuss today. So first, I'm going to give you a little information about the historical period on which I work and why we are interested in working with letters that were written at this time. Then I'm going to talk about a few of the problems we face in the course of our work, just to give you a little background. And after that, I'm going to tell you something about the database itself, this union catalogue, which is called Early Modern Letters Online. I'll explain why it has been constructed and how, what it is doing, how it's growing, and something about its work as it develops and collaborates with partners all over the world. And I'll explain as well how, by reuniting virtually large numbers of inventories of letters that once made up either an individual's correspondence or a discrete collection, and by making connections across large numbers of correspondences, this catalogue is providing a way to draw into focus networks that have not been easy to reconstruct thus far. And I'll talk about how this pool of data can be used by other projects investigating networks relevant to their work. The idea of a digital union catalogue of early modern correspondence came about originally in response to a fundamental problem with this particular form of manuscripts, so letters. from the 16th century onwards, the early 16th century, I should say, onwards, the evolution of postal communication allowed the unprecedented transfer of vast quantities of letters over distance. And what I'm showing you here is a map that was made by a Frenchman called Nicolas Sanson. It charts the postal routes in France as they had already opened up and evolved as early as 1632. And there's a tremendous network you will see in there. Each little line on the major routes that are coloured is part of the postal network. Of course, letters, once they were written and sent, by their very nature, were intended to travel. So described in their most simplistic terms, letters involve one person in one location writing words on paper to send to another person in another location, whether that location is 3 streets away, 3 cities away, or 3 counties away, or countries away, or continents away. So the exchange of letters that created a networked community of correspondence was always going to scatter the very documentation, namely the letters themselves, required to study it, posing from the moment of each letter's actual dispatch, so that is its moment of sending, a succession of headaches for scholars today when trying to gather them all back together. On top of this, many early modern individuals travelled. They didn't stay in one place, however hard it was back then to make a journey, but rather they traversed the length and breadth of Europe and often far beyond, sometimes in response to political upheavals, and just as today, to escape war. I'm going to talk in a minute about one man who did exactly this. And just as we do, these people also moved for work. They moved for religious reasons or for reasons of education. For example, physicians in the early modern period flocked to study at Padua in Italy or at Montpellier in France. So early modern letters were strewn across countries and across continents. And today, the surviving letters remain scattered in numerous archives and libraries and museums and private collections worldwide that have all evolved in different ways over time and have their different collection traditions. And even if a body of letters is known to have been kept by the person who was sending the letters, so copies were made as a sort of record of his or her outbox, or the originals that were sent were kept and filed by the person to whom they were addressed, so the equivalent of their inbox, or a letter or letters were acquired by an individual as a collection, we know that time does not tend to treat letters kindly, with sales and exchanges and the different interests of repositories and holdings all taking their toll and affecting breakups, separations, reshufflings and resettlings over hundreds of years of these manuscript archives. And of course, paper had many other uses. I'll talk about that later. It wasn't just once a letter had been sent, that letter could be used for many other things. So at Early Modern Letters Online, we are interested in who was writing to whom, what they were saying to each other, and why. The database came into being because in about 2008 to 9, a group of Oxford scholars in the history of science formed a research group called Cultures of Knowledge, Networking the Republic of Letters. They wanted to see what would happen if listings of different 17th century correspondences, and that's what they were largely focused on at that point, so 17th century correspondences, they wanted to see what would happen if the listings of these letters were thrown together. The best way to do this, they decided, was to build a union catalogue, that is a database constructed primarily to hold and to order the metadata of a correspondence. And by metadata, what I mean, and you probably all know this, but it does bear repeating, what I mean is the data that are required to describe each individual letter. And metadata, so metadata are the details that come together to describe something, whether an object or a larger piece of data, such as a letter record. And with metadata, we're able to describe a letter that still survives today. Or we're able to give more limited information, but information nonetheless, for a letter that does no longer survive. And we can use metadata to provide an indication of what is being talked about in the letter, whether or not we include details of the actual text or the text of the letter itself. And what we do is we take the basic details, so the date the letter was written, the name of the sender, the recipient of the letter, the place the letter was written, the place of the letter was being sent to. Sometimes this isn't always recorded, because in many libraries, the address panel on a letter, as you see in the bottom right here, it doesn't always survive. But where it does, we tag that, we record that. And we also tag the language that the letter was written in and the letter's retrieval information. This could be a reference to a library with the collection name and shelf mark, or it could be to a published edition, or to a digital publication, or to all three. EMLO, the Union Catalogue, takes this data, this metadata for each letter, and in this way brings together what we are able to reconstruct for a single person's correspondence. We put this into the database alongside data for the correspondences of other individuals, sharing records for both people and places, as well as the repository records, by which I mean the library or the archive that the letter is in. And we share these across the whole Union Catalogue. So by reuniting virtually inventories of letters that once made up either an early modern individual's correspondence or a discrete collection, and by making connections across multiple correspondences, early modern letters online draws into focus networks that have not been easy to reconstruct any other way. The Union Catalogue is beginning to enable scholars and research projects to explore the extent, the shape, and the character of a knowledge-based civil society that many at the time themselves referred to as the République des Lettres, the Republic of Letters, a network community that transcended political, confessional, so religious, and language boundaries to evolve into a remarkable international knowledge commons. This is what we are working with and why. But it's important to remember that the Union Catalogue EMLO, built by Cultures of Knowledge, began as an experiment. Initially, the focus was on a cluster of 4 key early European figures in the history of science, all with an Oxford connection, and crucially also all early fellows of England's Royal Society. You see here the first letter writers on whom we worked, and moving from the left of this slide to the right, you'll see an English mathematician who was appointed Oxford's Savilian Professor of Geometry from 1649 to 1703. He was called John Wallis. Then there was there is an English antiquarian and biographer called John Aubrey. He died in 1697. And then third from the left is an English but French-educated physician and natural philosopher called Martin Lister. He died in 1712. And a Welsh natural philosopher and the second curator of the Ashmolean Museum that's in Oxford. He's called Edward Lloyd, and he died in 1709. And then into this scientific community, we introduced the metadata for the correspondences of 2 more outward-facing, so more European and less Anglo-centric predecessors. That of the Moravian-born pansophist and pedagogue called Jan Amos Comenius, who fled his homeland and travelled across the face of Europe in response to the war and the political upheaval that swept across the continent in the course of his long life. He died when he was 78 in 1670. And as he travelled across Europe, he was writing numerous letters to numerous people, many of which don't survive, but he was a very interesting figure to put into our experiment. And then we added the German-born intelligencer, Samuel Hartlib. You see the outline for him. It's not really him. No picture survives for him. And in fact, I've cut out and put in the silhouette of our project director. Not that he knows this, and I've never confessed to him, but that's his outline, you see. So the German-born figure that we were focused on is called Samuel Hartlib. He settled in London. This metadata was created in partnership with a very early pioneering digital project, the Hartlib papers at the University of Sheffield. And Hartlib was interesting because although born in Germany, he moved to London in England, and he settled there and was based there for the rest of his life. He died in 1662, and while he was there, he was corresponding with large numbers of European figures across Europe. So metadata for the letters in these 6 correspondences were to be drawn together. But before we even began our experiment, it became very clear that this combined data set of about 12,000 letters in total wasn't going to be enough for a really effective experiment into who was writing to whom and why. And more data was going to be required by way of a backdrop, a sort of landscape against which we could search and sift and situate the letters we were focused on. And these 6 early modern correspondences, that's what we wanted to investigate. But in order to begin to pose any significant questions, we needed more. So we turned to an underutilized resource in the care of one of our founding partners at the University of Oxford's Bodleian Library. And there we worked with an analog card catalogue. Oh, I'm just going to go back up to that one. So bottom left, you'll see. And it's a series of cards that were all shelved in wooden drawers, and it was created between 1927 and 1964, and it describes just under 50,000 early modern manuscript letters that are in the library's special collections. Now, itemised in this catalogue are a number of significant correspondences, including literary, scholarly, diplomatic, administrative, personal and domestic letters from any number of individuals who contributed in no insignificant way to the epistolary conversations, so the conversations being conducted within the letters, and exchanges that played a crucial role in the wider republic of letters. The first and most pressing task we faced was to digitize the data to describe the letters in this analog index and create an interface with which to edit and standardize the records. We looked at the cards and their format very carefully, and we set out the relevant metadata fields with reference to a developing data model we were putting together. And I'll show you details of this data model later. Not very many fields were required to describe what we found. We needed an author. You can see on the card that I've put in the bottom right, you can see, we had an author, a recipient, a date, sometimes an origin, almost never a destination. And then we needed to record the Bodleian Library's name and the letter's collection and folio number. Now, the only feasible option, both financially and time-wise for us, as a research project, I should say that we were being funded at this point by the Mellon Foundation in America, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and we had 3 years to work on this. So the only option for us, both financially and time-wise, was to scan and key what was on the cards into a format we could edit. And we hired a company to do this work for us. It was a company that had already worked for the Bodleian. And when the keyed data came back, this revealed that we had exactly 65,520 cards, which we later reduced through our editing process to 48,668 letter records. We found that the overall number of cards contained overspill continuation cards for a number of letters, because you'll see there's an abstract on each of these cards, which is very useful. If you make that keyword searchable, you can do a tremendous amount with this data. but some of the abstracts were so long that they ran over onto continuation cards. So you might get one, or you might get two, occasionally three cards for each letter. And then one drawer we found had been scanned and keyed twice by mistake. And then we found a run of duplicates within the card that had been made within the cards themselves. So they had got a guard book from the library and actually done it, indexed it twice in the cards. And we had requested from the company we employed that the information be keyed just as it appeared in the cards into relevant columns in Excel spreadsheets. So you'll see an example set down at the bottom of this slide. With many hands and with many keyboards, though, the work was done within 6 weeks. For the next step, a colleague of mine called Kim took on the job of tidying up what would best be done within spreadsheets rather than in the fledgling editing interface. So shelf marks we had to work on. For example, the format of collection names needed to be agreed upon within the library and standardized. So did we put in MS for manuscript or with a full stop after it, or MS with no full stop after it for manuscript? These little details mattered. Or did we put FF full stop for folios, that's the page number, or did we put fols? And then there were many issues with spacings, for example, which when you're digitizing actually can turn out to be an issue. And remember, the records in this index had been typed manually onto these cards. Typists create typos. The keyers were asked to repeat exactly what they saw. And you can see some of the variants here in this slide. And keyers of the data create typos as well, as do us editors, of course. We're not exempt from creating typos and mistakes. And then dates. Well, these could be worked on in spreadsheets as well. And we were dealing with different expressions of day and month and year. We had to deal with different contemporary calendars that were being used in Europe at the time. So the Julian calendar or the Gregorian calendar, and given that they were early modern letters and many of them were written by scholars, there was a Roman calendar that was cropping up as well. This is the calendar that had been used 2000 years ago in ancient Rome. And these dates all had to be standardized. And if any of you ever in your work have to work with early modern dates and the calendars, and you find it a bit confusing, please do be in touch and I'll give you some useful reading. The most complicated task, though, that we faced in the entire digitization process of this card index involved editorial work on the places and the people. And it's one that anyone capturing and collecting data is going to encounter to a greater or lesser extent. In our case, to use just one example, there are many Thomas Smiths. They turn up listed as these, and more. There are more variants than just this. And John Smiths, which is an even more common name in England, well, there were even more of them. So the question we faced was which one was which? And it's not easy work. In this case, we began with a total of over 23,000 unique expressions of names just within this card index. And we had to figure out who was who and which were the same and which were not. For example, we had well over 100 ways of expressing just this one name, Thomas Smith, and many letters were attached to each expression of this name. Some were correctly attached, it might be to the Thomas Smith that we wanted, and some were incorrectly attached. It might be a mixture being attached to one particular name. And in all, just for Thomas Smith, there were over 18,000 letters. And this was just for people, just for people writing who were called Thomas Smith. And you can see it was slow and painstaking work. And we began to realize that deduplicating and reconciling people and place records at scale required a system more technically ambitious than that originally envisaged. And because of the full person data model we'd established, EMLO's early modern individuals required research of a type more akin to editing and updating entries in a biographical dictionary than in a regular library catalogue, because we really did need to dig into who was who and attach bits of biographical information to their record, so it was possible for people working in other correspondences to identify easily whether they were calling on the correct Thomas Smith. Of course, we needed to give each individual a master name and a unique ID within the system, just as anyone who is working with the dataset does. And we needed to attach to that master record all the relevant letters the individual had written and received. We needed as well to store the variant names, the early modern spellings, the language variants of that name, the different ways these people signed their own names. And these early modern individuals, some of you may know, they don't even do this consistently. One example is there's a scholar called Joseph Mead. He was a scholar based at Cambridge, and he spells his own name in 2 different ways in 2 consecutive sentences. And of course, we needed to ensure that all these names were fully searchable and attached to the correct record. We faced problems with changing titles that individuals held as well, and their different roles, as well as the changing names of women, because every time a woman marries, her name changes. And these snippets needed to be stitched together into one master record. And the same went for places, with their synonyms, their language variants, their historic names, their administrative areas. And if you think a place is stable, more stable perhaps than a person, but if you think a place is stable over centuries in terms of its name and the territories again, it's not. If you look up, for example, the history of Wrocław, which is now in Poland, it's also been called Breslau. And over the centuries, it's been captured and recaptured, and it's been in different countries, and different authorities have been administering it. Or perhaps you try identifying a place in France that's just recorded as Saint-Jean. Well, there are many, many of these in France, and we needed geo-coordinates and references, we realized, to an external authority file to help us in this work. Back in 2010, however, about 70%, that's quite a lot, of the people we were dealing with did not appear anywhere online, nor did the smaller places or the historical buildings. And this statistic has changed significantly over the last decade, as increasing numbers of historical figures are being given, for example, Wikipedia pages, and then the all-important Wikidata ID, and they're beginning to pop up in numerous online resources. Even so, you often all you can find is a very obscure article or an amateur genealogical site or blog. We tend to reference the first, so the article, we'll cite that. And if it's the only source, we store a record of, but we don't actually publish the amateur site, but we still store it if it's the only information we found. On many, many occasions with people, however, we still draw a complete blank, but it's important to give these people a name, as the name that appears in the letter, and a Floriat date, so the date that we know they're alive and they're writing or receiving a letter. And even if somebody is receiving a letter, but unbeknownst to the person sending the letter has already died, well, they're not going to be that long dead. I mean, you can be, the news will have filtered through within a few years at least. You can get an approximate Floriat date, even for a recipient, from the date of the letter. And we also wanted to pull in as much context as possible from the text for each person, just in case they turned up elsewhere as people were working in future on a correspondence. But if you look at the cards and imagine yourself back into the early mid-20th century when this index was compiled, some cards were handwritten, some were typed, and you think about the fact that just 3 people, it turned out, 2 of whom were retired non-specialist volunteers, and the other was a female member of the Bodleian's library staff who'd been taken on at the beginning of the 20th century before the First World War, and she'd actually been moved into financial administration. So the people who compiled this index, this card index, none of them was a trained archivist. They worked through nearly 50,000 manuscript letters ranging between the dates of 1508 to 1827 in countless different early modern hands and in numerous languages, from Latin and ancient Greek to English to Low German, Dutch. We've got some in all sorts of Middle Eastern languages. We've got Arabic. We've got ancient Syriac. We've got all sorts of languages in there, with no and they had no surviving, these 3 catalogers, no surviving index of agreed standards. I mean, it doesn't mean that they didn't have a style sheet or instructions and guidelines written down. I just haven't found evidence of it yet. I haven't found it. And I definitely see variations between the cards that the 3 catalogers made over the decades. And but you begin to see how what was intended to be an analog index, with the cards arranged by name of the author of the letter and then filed in drawers within the collection and ascending order of folio number, how these might not translate so readily to a digitized format. And what we were doing with their cards, these 3 catalogers would, working before computers were invented, they would never have imagined what we were doing in their wildest dreams. Alongside work on this card catalogue, of course, we needed to work on our pilot correspondences, and we employed 6 scholars, each of whom was an expert in one of these early modern individuals, and we began to set out the metadata for the 6 pilot correspondences. Although we were just collecting descriptions of the letter at this point to create an inventory, you'll see here in this slide that in addition to the analog card catalogue, the sources we were working from and the intended outcomes of the work were all slightly different. So we had one print edition that was already in train. The scholar working on him had already published 3 volumes. That was John Wallace. And then we had 2 print editions that were in the planning. Now, one had not even begun. That was John Aubrey's, and one was just getting going. That was Martin Lister, the physician, the 1/3 from the left. One of the correspondents we were working with was already forming part of an opera omnia, so a complete works, that was already being published in Prague, of which the letters formed just a very small part. That's Comenius. One of them involved pulling metadata to describe the letters from transcriptions that had been typed out in the 1970s that had to be put from these typescripts into Word files and then ultimately converted into a format we could work with. And these letters had no publisher at all, so they weren't planning a traditional hard copy edition. These were the letters of Edward Lloyd. And then we had the metadata from one pioneering digital project. I mentioned this before. This is Hartlib's letters, and they'd already transcribed and made the text available first online, first it was on a CD-ROM. And then because the CD-ROM became unreadable, they'd had to rescue the texts literally just in the nick of time and mount them on a platform at Sheffield University. But for our work, we needed to add in a considerable number of letters in other libraries, so not just in the archive at Sheffield. And we needed to add these into the inventory we were creating. Work on this had already begun in the year 2000, and by 2010, this work was in an outdated bespoke scholarly database that was actually very, very difficult to work with and to export the data from. So what we did was we developed an editorial interface into which, once we'd uploaded the basic metadata, we could work to continue to edit. And sitting beneath this, we developed the Union catalogue around a very detailed metadata model with more than 120 different fields that could be populated to describe just one letter and its associated people and places and sources. It covered, our data model covered dates, and I'm going to run here very quickly through an extremely simplified version of our data model. It's literally just got everything in boxes, and the uncertainty we had to cover dates and the uncertainties that were associated with them. And perhaps if there's time later, we could, in the discussion afterwards, we could return to the importance of uncertainties, because it's very, very important, we believe, to record these wherever you are working with data. The database also, though, had to be able to describe people. We needed to be able to put in everything that we to describe and differentiate between them. It also had to describe, include ways of describing location. And although we haven't still finished this section of the database, because we want to be able to incorporate details of how to record the changes in place that I mentioned earlier, the different administrative districts, the regions and the borders that a place lay within at different dates across nearly 4 centuries. So I can talk about this later if anyone is interested, but we're still working on this and developing a more advanced data model. We were recording as well the different languages that we used and to what purpose within letters. So we note whether quotations are in a particular language that's different from the original, the main text in the body of the letter. And then we have information about the different versions, of the letter, the manifestations we call them, and all the different material features that scholars and archivists might want to capture. Now up here, it's only a very small selection of what's possible to record for this in EMLO. But you see, any one letter might have tens of different versions. A manifestation means a different version of a letter. So for example, you could have a draft or a copy of a letter in manuscript, or you might be describing the manuscript letter that was actually sent, or you might be describing a copy that was made by the recipient or by somebody much later, or there may be many printed copies published at any point since the letter was written. There's one letter, for example, in EMLO that it has, I think it's 34 different versions of it. Very popular letter, clearly, because a letter might be printed over and over and over again in different publications. You also have to give details of the repositories, the library or archive where the manuscripts are found, in case you want to come into by the public interface of the database and search for everything that you can find in somewhere like the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, for example. And obviously, for both the manuscripts and the printed versions, you have to give exact collection name within a library or an archive and the folio number. Or for a printed version of the letter, you have to give the book's details with its page numbers or letter number. And it took 3 years in total for us to bring these pilot catalogues to publication. But EMLO launched its public interface in 2012, so roughly 3 years after we began. And here is an example of a letter record it's in the Comenius catalogue, the one who had to travel across Europe to flee war. And this is how his letter, I patched it together because it runs on down the page. So what you see on the right actually comes in at the bottom of what's on the left. But to be honest, we weren't expecting to continue after this point. We thought that we would publish what we'd worked on as an experiment and then stop, but not a bit of it, because at this point, a series of things happened. We were being approached by increasing numbers of scholars and students and libraries and publishers and research projects around the world, both digital and working in traditional hard copy format, wanting to add in their metadata. We'd realized too that we built a union catalogue, a database with more than 120 metadata fields, only a few of which had actually been used at that point. And those approaching us were very keen to take advantage of what we'd made possible. And then simultaneously, we'd also reached the conclusion that we needed to continue to collate yet more correspondence metadata if we were to examine in depth the shape and the connections within the so-called Republic of Letters, which is what we'd started out to do. Because what we had, after 3 years, what we'd compiled was still far too partial and incomplete. So on we went with a second round of funding from the generous Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And you might think, well, it'll be easy at this point, plain sailing, that we'd experimented with collating data from lots of different sources. We'd built a database, we'd got an advanced data model, and we'd got an editing interface. But no, not a bit of it. It actually became more complicated because we were being approached by individual scholars working in archives wanting to input their own data. We were being approached by research and correspondence projects, particularly those with digital editions, We were also being approached by scholars offering legacy data sets, publishers of early modern correspondence editions, and libraries and archives wanting to mount their own catalogues. And we'd had suggestions for catalogues of correspondence to be compiled from early modern editions, 19th century print editions, out of copyright 20th century print editions, 1960s printed editions, modern editions, all in various formats. And you see some examples here, some hard copy in libraries only, some in PDF, some on the Internet Archive or on Google Books, some in bespoke databases, some behind paywalls, and some with metadata partially or wholly compiled. Stuart and I were talking before this talk began about the correspondence of Joseph Scaliger, the books you see in the bottom left here. That's a traditional hard copy edition. It was published in 8 volumes by a publisher in Geneva called Droz. And we began to work with the metadata there, which had been collated for many years in the edition had been prepared for many years in the Warburg Institute in London. We were being asked as well to prepare exports of data from 2 major digital partner projects, one in Stanford in America and one in The Hague in the Netherlands. Stanford donated a partial inventory of letters from its Athanasius Kircher project. Kircher was a Jesuit scholar and polymath, 17th century, and the inventory of his letters was worked up for EMLO in spreadsheets by the postdoc who had been preparing the Comenius metadata. As luck would have it, Kircher had been the subject of her doctoral work. But at that point, Stanford were having problems with they were using Lunar Insight software, and they built this database. They were having real problems with it. And so adding an inventory into EMLO was a very good way for the postdoc to expand and edit it and to create a backup for Stanford. They were not able to export anything to us at that point, so our postdoc used her own files and worked up the metadata in spreadsheets and subsequently put them into EMLO edit and then worked in them there. The epistolarium, which is the sort of turquoisey blue and black little snip that I've put underneath Kircher, where you see the pictures and the figures. This is a project called the Epistolarium, and it was a large experimental project run in the Netherlands that had scanned texts from fairly elderly, early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century print editions of about 20,000 letters to and from 9 scientific figures that were representative of what was going on in the 17th century in the Netherlands. And it had published these without notes of any form or critical apparatus, so footnotes or anything like that, or without manifestation details. That is where the manuscript itself might actually be found. They published them in 2013 as the basis for a pioneering experiment in natural language processing and topic modeling of multilingual text corpora. And their metadata came to us in CSV files with a rudimentary person and place list. And what they wanted to do was add this basic inventory into EMLO and then link to the texts on their epistolarium database. And so we were back once again to the hard graft of adding in new letters and identifying, reconciling and folding in new people and place records where we needed to. But this is where EMLO really began to expand. So today, Early Modern Letters Online is a catalogue, a union catalogue, with more than 187,000 letter records, just under 33,000 people records, over 7,000 place records, and with more than 500 library records. And increasingly, EMLO is serving as a signpost within individual letter records to any number of external related resources, with at present over 177,000 links in place that point outwards from EMLO to richer resources that are hosted elsewhere on other databases. So I think at present, Early Modern Letters Online may be described as a union catalogue of basic metadata that links out to richer and more complete resources, to editions and authority files elsewhere. It's a combination of basic letter metadata that spans more than 3 centuries. I think I've already said the earliest letter is 1504 and the latest is 1857. These letters that we're listing were sent all over the world to every single continent except Antarctica. And as more letter data is added in, the connectedness of the people and the place records in the Union catalogue grows in density and in depth. It's a bit like weaving, really. The warp and weave becomes ever thicker and tighter as we continue to make connections within the whole. But EMLO's had to adapt over the years because we work with so many different types of contributor, all with differing needs. We decided back in 2013 to build an online web form into which contributing scholars could set out and review their own data. And this add-on to EMLO offers users a private working space where they log in and they create folders, and then they have letter forms into which they enter the metadata for each letter. And these draw live on EMLO's lists of people and places and repositories that are shared across all the correspondences in the Union catalogue. We developed a review area within this subsidiary database where the contributors can self-check their data, and I worked up a checklist of what they should look for to correct. And then when everything's ready, we enabled the metadata to be uploaded semi-automatically into EMLO. And this web form has proved to be an amazing collation tool for the basic metadata of letters, and scholars and projects around the world are using it now, day in and day out. However, the web form is not only used by scholars and archivists in the archive, because we receive, and you may well find that you have to work in your studies with similar source material at some point. We receive legacy data sets from a wide variety of formats. So we've been gifted shoeboxes, literally, of handwritten notes. We receive old ring folders of handwritten or typed notes. We receive handwritten or typed filing cards. Of course, this latter we've seen before with the card catalogue that we worked on in our pilot phase. We've also received letter descriptions and abstracts and transcriptions that are all handwritten, or they've been typed with old ribbon typewriters or with early word processors. In the past, I've been given a floppy disk from an Amstrad, a very early word processor that we couldn't do anything with. We were lucky in that instance because there was a printout supplied with it that was missing a few pages, but we just had to do our best. And we've received transcripts in WordPerfect, who works with that now, and the list goes on. And we tend to use the web form that we created to collect data for anything that isn't in some sort of structured format already. And often we have to do the work ourselves. Sometimes, for example, the contributor is no longer alive. I mean, that's the case in the case of one of the most recent catalogues that I've published in EMLO, the correspondence of a man called Janus Dauser, who was the first librarian at Leiden University in the Netherlands. There was a typescript of this inventory with handwritten corrections and no more. So the best thing we could do was add this data into the web form. And as for all contributors handing us everything upload and publication ready, if I'm honest, I don't think this has ever happened, not once, because even with well-structured data, it's never, ever ready to be ingested. In the early days of EMLO, we received dumps of structured data with insufficient information to be able to identify the associated people or places. It was as if we were expected to know by the people who was contributing this, or projects that were contributing this data, we were expected to know automatically which Thomas Smith was which, for example, or which grandfather and father and son with exactly the same name was which, without being able to look at the source letters themselves. Or we were expected to know which Newport or which Saint-Chapelle was which. And believe me, there are multiples with these names, multiple places in Europe with both of these names, just as an example. And so in an effort to minimize additional work for my very, very small team at EMLO, we began to work on a spreadsheet that was tailored to ensure that metadata was as upload ready as possible. It included a person, place, manifestation, and repository or library tab, each linked by EMLO's person, place, and repository numbers. But even this didn't work. Contributors tended to throw their letter metadata into the letter tab, the one top left, and then send it over and not have the time, or for whatever reason, be able to help with the people and place identification. So I began to be a little bit more assertive, and I used to say, well, we need all your people set out like this, second from the top, or I need all your places sent out like this, set out like this, third from the top, and your libraries and repository details set out like this, as you see at the bottom. And certainly having a more contributor-friendly spreadsheet helps, but it's not easy when you're working with so many different contributors and correspondences around the world. And we've had to develop a series of guides and manuals in quite a few different languages. And if I were to have to explain the different methods of upload, I'd say that we tend to use spreadsheets for all incoming correspondences that can be manipulated into one, from lists that are copy pasted from content pages in PDFs, or from digitized volumes that can then be separated out and manually checked and expanded. It tends to be quicker than working overall. It tends to be a quicker process than working into the web form. Often we receive from projects XML exports, so sort of hierarchical exports, or legacy files, inventories of letters that scholars have collected for their own work on a publication, but not that they've ever intended to publish. So the top one here, for example, was just some correspondence details that was collected for astronomers' letters by a scholar called Alan Mosley, who was working on astronomers' correspondence, Tycho Brahe in particular. And sometimes projects give us lists of people with no name, but just an authority resource ID. For example, the German National Library, the GND. And then we have to pull the data from that resource and set it out in a spreadsheet in order to reconcile it and be able to match it up either to existing people records or create new people records where we required to. And given EMLO began in 2009, when there weren't nearly so many resources online, I find I'm updating early people and place records that we created so many years ago that didn't have entries in any authority files back then, but they do now. So this collaborative data collation for letters feeds on into the ongoing editorial updates in EMLO for people and places. It's very time consuming and it's ongoing, but on it goes. Because reconciliation work is enormously important in a union catalogue. I don't know if you've ever used a resource called VIAF, the Virtual International Authority File, but in there you can see examples of a resource. It started off so wonderfully promisingly, and we thought, oh yes, this will be a superb resource to use, where they'll have one international ID for each person. But you see in there, if you look, an example of what can go wrong when you try to combine too much and you don't reconcile. You're combining all this material from different sources and you don't reconcile as much as you could or should, and you end up with, for example, at one point they had 6 records for the scientist Isaac Newton. So we developed, with a team of expert developers in Aalto in Finland, a trio of reconciliation tools for semi-automatic matching of our people and place records against EMLO's Sparkle endpoint. And these tools search across the master names, the synonyms, and the roles that we have already in EMLO for people. And we run a list of an incoming data set, the people records in that. We run it through this reconciliation tool. And for places we're searching across the master names and the synonyms and the areas that they are in. And what these tools do is they auto-suggest possible matches that we can check and accept, in which case, if we accept it, the relevant ID number from EMLO is inserted into the list that we're working to upload. Or we can sort of query it with a note to say that actually we want to investigate this further because we're not sure, or we can reject the automatic suggestion. And they're incredibly helpful tools. And we have one to assist as well in the identification of duplicate letter records. So they're a sort of bespoke in-house, EMLO in-house variation on Open Refine. And if you're interested, the details of them are all available on GitHub. But I think it's important for me to tell you that after working for correspondence metadata for about 14 years, whenever I think, oh, I've seen this sort of data set before, we can do exactly what we did for that data set, for that correspondence. I can be 100% certain that I'm going to find it's not quite the same. So I always create a work document, workflow document for each correspondence to give to each contributor, and it's always different. Just as the focus within each of the 6 pilot correspondences with which we began was subtly different, and EMLO and I have had to learn to be adaptable. And you may laugh at this, but until 2017, so that's 8 years after EMLO began, with what we were convinced was, the most comprehensive data model to describe early modern letters that we could have built, we suddenly realized we hadn't thought of everything. Because one of our contributing projects, our partners, was collating data in the Netherlands. It's called the Signed, Sealed and Undelivered project. It's at the Postal Museum in The Hague. And they were working with a little cache of letters that had been preserved in a trunk. They'd been discovered in the trunk you see on the top left, and they were not stored as most letters are today in a library or an archive. There are about 2,500 of these letters in total, and it turned out that about 700 of them had never been opened, and the seals for all these letters are intact. The reason they hadn't been opened was because very often they'd been collected by a postmaster, and very often when he tried to deliver the letters, either people weren't at the address they were supposed to be, or they were long gone, they'd left, they'd moved on, or they didn't want to pay the fee that they had to pay to receive a letter, because you paid at the point of receipt of the letter. They didn't want it, so they refused it. So for many different reasons, these were never delivered, and he kept them. This man Brienne, he kept them in this trunk. It's still the original case that they were stored in. And what this project is doing is they're treating these letters as museum artifacts. They're not opening them. Rather, they're choosing to wait until technology evolves and becomes cheap enough to image what's inside each of these 700 letters. I mean, they've run a few tests already, and they've managed to read at least a couple. But what they want to do is read the content without breaking the seal. And first of all, the project wanted, when we began discussions with them, they wanted to record details of how the paper was cut and folded and sealed, the watermarks in the paper that they found, and the postal marks, all these sorts of details that we'd thought of. We had that in our data model. It wasn't a problem, and EMLO can deal with all of that. But what we didn't have fields for was whether the letter had been opened or not, and also whether if it had been opened, is it stored flat and unfolded? So every letter that I'd ever worked with up until that point in a library had always been opened and stored flat. And we needed to record whether it was stored like that or whether it was actually stored folded. And then where there are folds in the letter, this project wanted to look at, are the folds the original folds that were involved with the actual folding up of the letter in order to seal it and send it, or are they later archival folds? And it had never occurred to any of us that our contributors were going to want to record this. So we had to go back to the drawing board, and we had to add in new metadata fields and come up with an efficient way to collate, upload and display this data while the project was working on how best to describe it. It's a fascinating project, actually, if you ever want to look it up. And they're coming up with different ways. They're categorizing how letters were folded, the different ways there are to fold and seal a letter. And they're not just restricted to the early modern period. They've got letters from the early 20th century as well they're looking at, and they're categorizing each type of folding and sealing. So you can imagine, with all these different metadata being added into EMLO by scholars and digital projects and research projects and libraries and publishers worldwide, all of whom wish their data to be connected into a greater whole rather than to exist in isolation in separate silos. This is where reassembling scattered letters and the wealth of information that they contain, and by charting the shape and the history of the letter writing communities, this is how a union catalogue can come into its own, reassembling the disparate pieces of the larger correspondence puzzles. It's where wide-ranging questions may be posed and hitherto unnoticed connections across correspondences and within networks can be brought to light. So obviously, of course, EMLO can be used as a finding aid. I've talked a little bit about that. It can be used to focus on individual as well as thematic correspondences. I haven't really talked about the text, but in addition to tagging people mentioned and using topic keywords, we have many, many searchable abstracts and increasingly transcriptions of the content of the letters themselves, although obviously this takes a lot longer to work up. EMLO's tools are used as a metadata management system by many scholars and projects and students, especially those who work alone or don't have the funds or time to develop and sustain their own databases. Many scholars and projects, as I've mentioned, want to display just very basic metadata. Some want to link out to full records elsewhere. So EMLO in those cases does no more than to direct users to the Letters Authority database. So, you remember the slide I put up of the signpost. We're constantly directing EMLO's users out to other resources and texts mounted elsewhere. Others, though, want to record extremely detailed metadata. Some want to record chains of correspondence so that letter B replied to letter A, for example, and that letter B in turn was answered by letter C. And then they want to say that in these three letters, for example, a particular topic was discussed. Or they might want to look at postal routes and lengths of delivery time, for example. And some want to work with women's correspondence, only women's correspondence. And in EMLO, there is a catalogue called WEMLO, or Early Modern Letters, Women's Early Modern Letters Online, with a community of scholars working, developing a forum and an area for discussion and exchange. We've made it possible for users to search by women's correspondence alone, by letters to, from, or mentioning women. And looking around at most library catalogues, even today, it's remarkable how few permit a search by gender. I don't know what it's like at your university, but here in Oxford, if you want to search for items written just by women or just by men, it's not actually possible. So we've made it possible within EMLO to search by gender. And you'll see here a letter record page in EMLO for one of an 18th century woman's letters, with all its various links leading out, including, of course, to the journal where a PDF of the letter text, the transcriptions, may be downloaded. Now, I'm just going to pause for a moment to talk about this woman. She's called Elizabeth Elstob. She was born in 1683 and she died in 56. Her brother was a scholar, William Elstob. He was an antiquarian, and Elizabeth helped him with his work and his publications. Of course, an early 18th century woman, she didn't receive official credit for her work. And when he died, she was left alone with no money and she was unmarried. So Elizabeth Elstob disappeared at this point. She left London. She abandoned her books and her manuscripts, and she fled to a small town in Worcestershire in England called Evesham. And there she set up a school for girls. I suspect it was the only way she could think of to make a living for herself. And you might think that she and her work would be forgotten, because only 52 letters that she wrote or received have been tracked down so far. And she seems to have corresponded with just 5 people in these surviving 52 letters. But earlier this year, I conducted a little experiment. I decided to search for her in the letters that were written to and from other people that we have in Emlo, and try to explore whether she was being mentioned by them, whether she was being talked about in these letters. Now, many of the references I found concern her poor health and her very precarious financial situation. And these misfortunes are all charted in the mentions of her in the letters of others. And these are letters mainly being written from men to men. And so far, I've found 84 references to Elizabeth Elstob, just any other letters that we've currently got described in Emlo. And I've not looked any further yet. These letters in which she is mentioned range from 1709 and they extend to 1770. So 14 years after her death, people were still talking about her. At this stage, they were talking more about her work, her scholarly work, than her precarious financial situation. And these letters involved 27 other people to whom she didn't write, talking about her. And remember, we find just 5 correspondence in her surviving 52 letters. So 73 of the 84 third-party letters were written during Elizabeth Elstob's lifetime, and 11 were written after her death. 4 letters had been catalogued already in Emlo with no date, but when I looked at them more carefully, one referred clearly to Elizabeth Elstob as being alive, so I was able to give that a date. This was written before 1756, and 3 refer to her as being long dead, so I was able to say this was written approximately circa 1760 or after. And I don't know about you, but I was really excited that for a woman whose surviving correspondence appears at present to be so small, to find that she is mentioned in 84 other letters by 27 other people writing about her. I find that really wonderful. And I think there's an awful lot more work that we could be doing with the data sets that we have to find out more about people's lives, especially women, because it helps to recreate the landscape that surrounds an individual. Just a few glimpses of third-party observations of what might be going on in a life. And if you look in these letters, you begin to find out what else is happening around a particular person. It might be too that these people talking about an individual might have been corresponding with them, and if we can track down more of their letters, it might lead to a discovery of a new letter for whether it's Elizabeth Elstob or another individual. Or there might be multiple letters there if we look in these other correspondences. It's all possible. And then, of course, it's fascinating to see that there was sustained interest in, for example, Elizabeth Elstob after her death. She has an afterlife. And this approach really comes into its own when you have a figure who dies and then you tag the correspondence of somebody else, another individual who's working on that figure, perhaps a biographer. So you might think about Isaac Newton, the scientist, and then his first biographer was a man called William Stukeley. He was an antiquarian and he actually knew, he was much younger than Isaac Newton, but he met him once. I think they had the equivalent of tea or something. And Stukeley was the originator of this falling apple story. So his letters are worth collecting and looking at if you're working on Isaac Newton. And Elizabeth, this example of Elizabeth Elstob, I mean, it's just one tiny case where you see how Emlo provides an ocean, a sort of surrounding ocean in which we can situate an individual. She gives validation to the decision that was made to keep women's early modern letters online within Emlo, because for a brief time, we were actually discussing the possibility in about 2016 of publishing women's letters in a separate database. But this illustrates the advantage of not working in silos and of connecting into the larger pool and then on out to other resources. So at every stage, with all the work we do, it's vital to keep asking the question, and you must always remember to do this with any metadata that you're collecting. What do we need this data to do? Of course, as I've said, many times now, EMLO is a finding aid and it's a publication platform, but it serves other purposes as well. So many scholars, including digital humanists, wish to analyse or visualise the data. And for 4 years, EMLO was part of a European-funded initiative called Reassembling the Republic of Letters. The funding that we received for this didn't cover research, but rather networking and bringing groups of experts together to discuss shared standards so we brought them together for conferences, for training schools, for workshops, and short-term exchange visits between universities. The whole initiative was chaired by our director, the director of the Cultures of Knowledge project, Professor Howard Hodson, and it enabled discussion between scholars of early modern letters and IT experts and librarians and archivists and publishers to investigate and agree shared standards and systems. It involved 36 different countries and more than 200 expert individuals. And what we did was divide them into 6 working discussion groups. And these groups were each determined by the basic features of the letters themselves. And we asked the experts in these groups to consider the problems associated with working digitally with early modern letters in, firstly, space and time. So that is the chronological and geographical dimensions of an exchange of letters. Then we had a group called People and Networks, and what we were asking them to do was discuss the biographical and social dimensions, the individual correspondence and the networks of which they are a part. We wanted to start being able to look more closely at those. How best were we to go about it? Then we had a group that was called Texts and Topics, and this group considered the texts of the letters themselves and the topics that were being written about within these letters. Then we had a group that was to discuss documents and collections, the material properties of letters, their archival histories, and the task of locating them. Another group called Data Exchange and Strategic Planning considered the strategic issues of data exchange between participating projects and institutions. And then finally, the group for Visualization and Communication brought together the visualization agendas that are common to the first 4 groups that we had working, and also the issues of communicating the research of the project to scholarly audiences and the general public. And on the back of this work, a multi-authored open source volume, more of the type you find in scientific research, to be honest, was published to lay out the findings and a blueprint for future work. It's available freely for download at the address that's up on this slide. And if you're interested, you just go there and you can, where it says download view document or download PDF, you can, I may have sent you a link already, actually. I'm ashamed to admit I can't remember, but it's worth looking at this because it's a very interesting discussion document. And then for 3 years after this, between 2018 and 2021, EMLO partnered with scholars at Cambridge University and at Queen Mary University in London on a large UK Arts and Humanities Research Council project that was called Networking Archives. This project involved working with the letters found in the Stuart State Papers. That means they were 17th century letters. So the official correspondence that had been retained by the state. And these are housed in the UK's National Archives. The partners we were working with at Cambridge and Queen Mary London had previously worked on the letters in the Tudor State Papers. Now that means they were essentially 16th century letters. The Tudor period ended in 1603. And the objective that we had as a networking archives project was to combine quantitative network analysis with traditional research approaches to discover what the meta-archive, in this case, what we're talking about was the data sets for the Tudor 16th, the Stuart 17th century state papers, alongside the data set that makes up the Emlo Union catalogue, to discover what it reveals about the way in which intelligence was gathered and transmitted in the early modern period. We developed new tools, specifically for the project. We began to look at the fingerprints, if I can call them that, of early modern individuals to see if we could work out who were the previously unknown but crucial members of a network. We began to examine the contacts of contacts. We might be looking for the fingerprint of a known spy, for example. Does he or she, because we also found female spies, do they have a digital fingerprint similar to anyone else in the same network? And we asked the question, what does the fingerprint of a known early modern intelligencer look like, for example? And by intelligencer, we mean someone who's passing information openly. So not like a covert, somebody who wishes to remain hidden, not like a political spy, but somebody who's openly passing information, whether it's news and gossip, or perhaps details of the publications of books and scholarly information, because in the 17th century, especially about the time of the formation in the 1660s and 70s of the early Royal Society, there were a lot of scientific figures who were exchanging scientific information, scientific knowledge, and we wanted to start to look at that in more detail. Now, is their profile of these sort of open intelligencers? It is significantly different. I mean, you won't be surprised, from the fingerprint of someone who wishes to remain below the radar, who doesn't want to be detected. And the results of the research that we did on this project, they're all in the process of publication. And we've got 2 significant volumes that are going to come out, I think, in the course of next year. Again, if you're interested in this sort of work, I can give you details of some articles that have already been published, and I can give you details of what's forthcoming, so you can keep an eye open for it. Whatever we do, however, at Emlo, whatever project we are a part of, we know we will always be dealing with a partial data set. Many letters that provide evidence of the written correspondences that are being conducted in the early modern period haven't survived. I mentioned right at the beginning of this talk that the paper on which the letters are written, it's very fragile. It had other uses. A letter might be written on a second time, or it might ultimately, over and over again, it might be used for making lists or whatever, and then thrown out, worn out and thrown away. Or we've got records of paper letters being used as fuel to cook, to keep warm, or it might have been used to wrap things. Certainly we know when people were moving, just as we do today, newspapers they used to use letters to wrap up their precious things. And we've got records too of people who were using letters to curl their hair overnight. And the letters that were sent went on very long journeys. The boats carrying them sank, or they were seized at sea by another country's ship, or post bags could be stolen, or they fell off the back of carriages. We've got examples of that. And then other people picked them up, and they might have tried to use them as a source for making money, because, as I said, you have to pay on receipt of the letter. So if you get hold of a body of letters, you can go to the recipient and say, you pay me you can only have this if you pay me for it. So there's quite a lot of theft of letters, or the person, so for many reasons the letter just doesn't arrive, or the person who sent the letter, we have lots of examples of this, is actually asking for it to be burned after it had been read. Now, a lot of letters weren't burned, clearly, because we can see the letter, it still survives and it says burn upon reading, but clearly a lot of letters were read and burned, and so we will never know what was in them. Or I'll come to that in a minute. We might have some clues. And we even have an account of one letter that was eaten, and of another that was being pulled from a man's mouth when he was captured, and the chewed letter survives. That's in the Bodleian Library. And we might, we can go some way. I say, will we never know what was in these letters? Well, we can go some way to beginning to fill in details for just a few of the letters that haven't survived. The known unknowns, I call them. For example, when we read in an existing letter, I received your letter of last Thursday, but the letter from last Thursday doesn't seem to survive. We can create a basic record for this lost letter and record it as having been sent, written, received, and read, but not thought to survive. Because as I explained right at the very beginning, metadata, you don't actually have to have a physical object to use metadata to describe something. And of course, an overview of the whole data set that we're bringing together, that can help to identify larger gaps, which if we investigate, sometimes turn out to be because, for example, a whole archive was destroyed in a fire. So remember Samuel Hartlib, the German-born intelligencer who moved, one of our pilot correspondences, he moved to London and he was based there for the rest of his life. Well, we know that he suffered a terrible fire and huge portion of his archive burned. He was living in Axe Yard in Westminster, and there was a fire and a lot was destroyed. Or letters can be lost at sea, for example. Ships go down, and then we have records that ship went down. But by shading in these gaps with notes, you can begin to build up a sort of shadow archive. I often call it the ghost archive. And it is useful, it's really useful when you begin to consider the whole. And at the same time, the same overview, so working with visualization and analysis tools, another thing it's really useful for is it can help to identify mistakes. And I often use what our data analysts create solely for this purpose. Why is a letter recorded as being sent from the middle of the ocean? Was it written and then sort of carried on the ship from there? Or has there been a mistake in the recording of the geographic coordinates? That happens quite often. My takeaways, I'll just finish by giving you some of my takeaways, I think, from working on all these different early modern correspondence data sets, are that to create metadata, as you're collecting it, you use whatever seems the most efficient way to suit the subject matter, its format, the research focus, the contributors, if you're working with any, and to ask at every stage, what do we need to do with the data? What metadata fields do we need to achieve this, and what format would the data best be in? I have a series of questions that I run through before setting out a workflow for each new correspondence that is collated for publication in EMLO. And I won't go into these in any detail because they're very letter specific, but you're welcome to have a copy at any point if it's of help to you. But I will emphasize that what we're trying to do in the EMLO Union catalogue is to work with many or multiple partners to bring together multiple disparate bodies of correspondence from many and various sources and many and various histories and cataloguing traditions. And as we do this, we always try to preserve the integrity of the source whilst making it compatible with the whole. Now, you may find yourselves at some point in your careers having to do the same with data. And if there's one thing I'd urge you to take away from this talk, it's to suggest that you remember as you go that none of us at any point should really be working like this. We do have to standardize in order to create our metadata as accurately as possible. And we need to create accurate metadata if we want to help research projects analyze their data like this. This is a partner project here in Oxford working on the letters of an English poet for which we published the metadata in EMLO. And of course, as a project, we do need accurate metadata as we continue to explore the extent, the shape, and the character of the Republic of Letters as a whole. And it's exactly the same for you. You will need to curate carefully whatever data you work with in future, for whatever reason, whether you're investigating historical questions or analysing data sets of relevance to life today. In Emlo's case, we're looking forwards to continuing to add ever more correspondence to our union catalogue in a bid to chart the shapes, the overlaps, and the histories of the letter writing communities in the early modern period. Now, I wish you all luck and happiness wherever and whenever you work with metadata, because there's so much that you can do with it. And I'd also like to thank you very much for listening. I hope it's come across clearly enough. And do ask questions if you have any. I'm going to try and unshare my screen now.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Miranda, for that tremendously interesting presentation, which really gave us an excellent idea, both of the genesis and the development of this tremendous project, which is really, which I guess you've sort of built from the ground up. It's really starting with those wonderful little card catalog cards,
Yes, you can't. Do you know what's so sad is the card catalogue, since we digitized it, has been removed from the library. It's now in storage, it's in boxes. It's so sad. And that's one of the negatives of doing this, I think.
So we have about 3, 4, 5 minutes left. So I was.
Oh my Lord! I thought I was doing to an hour.
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. Time difference.
My goodness, terrible sorry.
It's okay. So we have a question in the chat. So I'll just read that out. So the listener says, thank you very much. Fascinating. There are also letters that have been later used as stationery and are therefore hidden in other types of archives, namely literary archives. And I might add a sort of more general question, and maybe you can address the two either together or separately. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of either collaboration or
you've frozen here.
Overlap in terms of people. Sorry.
I'm terribly sorry. You froze for about 30 seconds. I didn't, 15 seconds or so. I didn't hear that. So you wanted me to talk about the overlap?
Between humanists and technicians, given the rise of digital humanities as a discipline.
That's a really interesting question. I'll just quickly say to Katerina's, yes, there are also letters, you're quite right, that have been used as stationery and are hidden. Yes, absolutely. And so the overlap between scholars, traditional scholars, and the projects that we work with, and the technicians and the more DH scholars, it's an interesting one actually, because the scholars are very, they really are concerned with what is in the letter, and they are wanting to record meticulously that. They're not always so interested in looking at the bigger picture. The more digital humanists and the technical people they just want the data and they'll manipulate it and they'll come up with something. It doesn't always matter to them quite so much how accurate it is. So you do have a conflict almost immediately before you start. And one of the things I said I'd return to is this idea of uncertainties. You see, the more technical analysts, the data analysts, they're not so concerned with the uncertainties. And the uncertainties might be if you have the date of a letter, but you don't know exactly when it is. You've you either think it's approximately because you've got other sources, or it's about this time, or you might have an incomplete date. You might just have a year, but not a day and a month, or you might know from other sources that they're talking about a fire in the letter, and that fire happened on a certain date. So you record, it's not 100% certain that this date is, or it might be you're not 100% certain who's written the letter or received the letter, and you flag that. And then when you come through into visualizing this data or analyzing it, you can then have an attached README file that says, if you've got the right columns that say approximate or inferred or circa date, you can have a README file that says 24% of the dates in this data set that were used to create this analysis or visualization were either, were uncertain, say. Because if you don't include that, and this is where I think a lot of the more technical digital historians don't always appreciate this. If you don't include this, you're putting a date across or the authorship of a letter across as fact, and you're sort of flattening it out, and you're not allowing for this nuance. And I think most of us working in EMLO believe that it's really important to capture this, because otherwise you're putting out, as I say, this flattened, this is fact. And we know in sort of, you see in scholarship how people take, oh, this is fact, and they don't actually go back to the source. They take, oh, I've seen this and I'll quote that, and they don't go back, and the mistakes get sort of repeated and repeated and handed down. And so I think that's a very important difference, and that's something where I think a lot of humanities scholars are beginning to teach some of the people who've come across from the scientific subjects and are working with data, and it's sort of nuancing. That's the thing I've noticed most, to be honest. And there can be a difference, and because a lot of the more science-based, just give us the data, and it doesn't really matter to them if this Thomas Smith is sort of lumped together with that Thomas Smith. They're not too so interested in the detail, whereas scholars are, and it can cause tension. So does that answer your question? Sorry.
Yes, well, hopefully with the development of the digital, yeah.
Gosh, I hope I can't actually hear at the moment. I don't know if you can hear me. I didn't.
Oh yes. Oh yes, I can. I think the problem's actually my end. Yes, sorry. I was just saying, hopefully as time goes on, these two sides will converge, as it were.
I think that they are. I think there are many lessons that each side can learn from the other. And I think it's really important to collaborate. So the more collaboration and discussions, and that this is going to sound very silly, but one of the most fruitful things that I can recommend, if you find yourself in this situation where you're working with a lot of analysts, and they might have come from wherever they've, whatever their background, and then you've got scholars as well, the best thing you can do is bring them all together and with food and drink. So tea, and in England it's tea and cakes, but just talking things through, rather than just sending, oh, here's our data, will you do something with it? And they do it and they send it back, and then everything conducted like this. Even, I mean, we found in lockdown, the networking archives project that I was talking about, the one looking at the state papers, that was during lockdown. We couldn't meet, and just working online, like this, although not with somebody talking nonstop and not allowing time for discussion, but just having very regular meetings where we could talk and being a bit more relaxed, so we could have breakouts and discuss around different things. It was really helpful. And I think it helped each to understand the others, where they were coming from and their concerns, and what the problems were that they were facing. And that actually was, it was transformational. So, and we managed to avoid conflicts on that project, which was good.
Right. So I think we've very unfortunately run out of time, but I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking our speaker, Miranda Lewis, for the very enlightening and wide-ranging presentation, which I learned a lot from, and I'm sure everyone else did. So I'll just mention very quickly the final presentation of this term, which will be Professor Daniel Lord Smale. His Lord is his middle name. It's not a title. He's not he's not a peer of the realm. But he's going to be talking to us about the Dame project, which is a digital medieval project that combines texts and images in interesting and enlightening ways. So I'm sure I'll see many of you there. Otherwise, I think it's around about dinner time for everyone here in Hong Kong, and I'm sure it's getting close to lunchtime back in the UK. So I'll wish everyone a good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you happen to be in the world. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Miranda.
much.
Miranda.
Thank you. And if anyone has any questions at any point, do email. That's not a problem. I can help in any way. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good
Good luck.
day. Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.